Okay, just one quick second to stop. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Any?
Yeah, hi. Could you maybe elaborate on the tax implications of using Bitcoins in Asia?
Sorry, can you speak?
Could the panel elaborate on the tax implications of using Bitcoin in Asia?
I can just quickly comment on Taiwan is that it has to fall within the existing tax structure. And so, and it's considered a commodity or a good. So if I use Bitcoin to buy something in a store, the store has to issue a FAPIAL, a government uniform invoice receipt. So it's subject to all of the same tax requirements as it would be for any other asset or commodity. But Hong Kong maybe?
In the United States, not this is particularly relevant for this conversation, but since you asked about tax, and the United States have issued clear guidelines or semi-clear guidelines that Bitcoin should be treated for the purposes of tax as property.
Does that mean it's like capital gains or the equivalent?
That means capital gains.
Yeah. Okay.
It really sucks.
I think in China it's just trading like virtual goods, something like that. But because of it's so difficult to tax on that, so that's why the bank just stop, accept it as a trading side. Yeah. So the normal, I think the fees is just money exchange fee from the, the Bitcoin exchange. They will charge fees. Yeah.
Any other questions at this point? Okay. We've talked about Bitcoin as a currency, and we've talked about it as a means of payment. Are they really the same, or should they be distinguished when we're looking at it for adoption?
I think it's important to compartmentalize Bitcoin the currency and Bitcoin the payment method, right? So Bitcoin the payment method is really probably what's most interesting to people in this room, in that it's a way to transmit resources from one place to another instantly, anonymously, at extremely low cost. Effectively, every transaction is now a book transfer, but there's no central authority. It's the greatest thing ever. Now, Bitcoin, the currency, these things for now have to be intrinsically linked, but Bitcoin, the currency, is what terrifies the operators because of fluctuations in value and so on. But there are ways to abstract away the currency, and the ways to abstract away are to just buy and sell at the point of transaction. We touched on regulation before, and in the Isle of Man, for example, you have to, operators are required to hold enough cash assets to cover all player balances. Now, if you're taking a deposit in Bitcoin, you immediately fall foul of that requirement. So you have to sell on the spot and hold cash anyway. So when you're doing this, Bitcoin, the currency, it becomes mostly irrelevant, and you just enjoy the wonderful benefits of the transaction protocol.
You raised something there, actually, because you're talking about regulation and accepting Bitcoin for payment for a licensed casino. Any comments on whether Bitcoin, change the model. I pull the cash out of the side. I want to open a Bitcoin casino. Or a virtual currency casino. I only accept payment in Bitcoin. Where does that fall generally under some of these jurisdictions that license to regulate gaming?
Well, you wouldn't get a license in the Isle of Man or in Gibraltar or Malta or anything like that. You'd have to go to Costa Rica or Curacao. But yeah, you could do it. That is being done.
I think it's about educating people. It's educating regulators. It's educating them to feel comfortable with a slightly different business model in the way that social gaming prompted people to scratch their heads. And I don't think that even if you can see the really only the upside of using Bitcoins, that it still is dragging this whole kind of very, very negative legacy, which is partly as a result of ignorance. It's partly because people aren't technically savvy. It's partly, and certainly regulators generally speaking aren't, and that's why they didn't really know what to do with social games until they realized it was so big they actually did have to do something about it. And you still get those negative stories in the press about Bitcoin. It's not just about the velocity, is it? It's about people saying about it's a perfect vehicle for money laundering, it's anonymous transactions. Even if the transactions chain is clear, it's just the people who are actually using them.
Right, actually, because there's two good points that you raised there. One is the anonymity of the user, because that's something people are always raising as a concern. But that's not actually the case. And perhaps you could someone want to give a bit of an explanation on why that is not the case?
Well, I mean, any operator has to abide by the the rules of their regulator, right? So that typically means like quite a stringent KYC process. They typically need to know identity and address of all of their users. So the fact that money's come in that's effectively digital cash, that doesn't kind of work around those requirements. The user's still got to go through this KYC process. So in that respect, it's not really a concern. And the other is, in the Bitcoin network, there is this public ledger, so you can see the origin of all of the of every transaction. That might sound counterintuitive because we've just been banging on about how everything is anonymous. It's as anonymous as the user wants it to be, basically, whereby if they don't want to identify the source address, who it's linked to, they don't need to. But if you as an operator require them to do so, they can do so.
Right, and just to add to that, you know, back to the original summary, if you will, of Bitcoin as digital cash. I mean, it does provide for some layer of anonymity because we don't know who the addresses necessarily belong to, but operators can take the KYC and AML requirements that they've followed and know exactly where those funds are coming from. They can also attach bank accounts to those accounts so that they then know precisely where those funds are coming from. So it's really in the operator's control. And if we think about this, no system is perfect, right? But it's certainly better than a cash system in terms of both the KYC that can be followed and reducing anonymity in payments.
Second point you touched upon, and I'm going to raise it because it's constantly raised in the media, is money laundering. Now, I think most of us will probably agree that it could be used for money laundering. However,
So can cash.
so can cash, yes, definitely. Right? And it's actually far easier to hand over a bag of money than it is to go through the process of exchanging bitcoins. But does anybody want to speak on the money laundering side of it?
I think that's part of, you know, the questions, you know, normally the operators ask, because Bitcoin can be used for the money laundering, definitely. But considering the value and the portion of, I think it's going to be very hard if you want to like doing some big transactions, because the Bitcoin transaction compared with the traditional, you know, transaction is relatively small. So I would say it's able to do that, but